So we're going to work today. Hi, Angus. Hi, Raynand. Nicola will join us soon. We're going to start today with the second half of chapter 6, which is the narrative really about the bits that we know, or the stories that we know from the biblical passages, and how Steiner differentiates these from we could say, the more traditional understanding. And the first thing that we could really say is that this is an esoteric account of Paul's Christology, is really what I argue. And this particular section to the end of the chapter deals a lot with two major themes that I will try and bring out to illustrate Steiner's esoteric interpretation, which is the Nestorian teaching of Christ and Jesus joining together at the baptism. Jesus being the fully human side and Christ being the fully divine side of this being that comes into existence at the baptism in the Jordan. And then the second part of the themes, or the second theme that I unpacked during this, is the work of the syzygy. So how the divine works through both Christ and Sophia, or through Jesus and Mary in the redemption of the human soul, is an aspect that Steiner really brings quite strongly for us to consider, which I always find very helpful in our modern context of where we're up to in sort of theology and spirituality and religion, trying to bring the divine feminine back into play. Steiner has a lot to offer on that. So we look at this other side, is that, of course, while we're dealing with that aspect of the syzygy and of the fully human and the fully divine, I'm going to, or I did in the text, deal with the Gospel of John. So rather than trying to bring the methodology of Steiner, the four points of the methodology of Steiner, into play through all the Gospels, I focused on the Gospel of John as the narrative that I'm going to use to try and illustrate how that works in this thing of, the history, Christ, the four aspects of, it's an historical event. Christ works through history and evolution. It is an initiation text, and then the Christ impulse that helps work with the human being, and how that came into existence through these next chapters: the baptism, the transformation of the human soul, the death and resurrection, and then Ascension and Pentecost. So it really is the last, or the sort of the major part of the biblical narrative that we know, but from this more esoteric side. So that being said, we're trying to work to understand how the narrative, or the text for contemplation, works as a mythical initiation story, taking for granted possibly that it is also an historical account of the redemption of the human being. So for Steiner, something completely new comes into existence at the baptism of Jesus of Nazareth. Last time we talked about the 18 years where the Christ had gone through these or Jesus of Nazareth had gone through these, very painful, suffering situations, and then shared his story with his mother. And now we see him come to the baptism, and the being that had been at work in the Nathan soul, the Zarathustran being, leaves Jesus of Nazareth, and the Christ being can descend in the form of a dove. And this is the really core difference with the monophysitism, which is, Christ became human through Mary, through the conception and the birth of Jesus. Christ became human. Here we see Jesus, the human soul, came to the earth, and Christ then, and this is quite an important part, that through those 18 years, this high being Zarathustra had worked upon the soul and body of Jesus of Nazareth to begin a transformation, to make it ready for the Christ to take it to a further maturation and a further transformation, we could say, for then the Christ impulse to work in us. So it also works under the principle of as we've talked before, the spiritual economy, which is if faculties that are to become common to many people, they must appear first in one person. And through the work of Christ, with the human faculties of Jesus, a new morphic resonance is created, which is a seed archetype for the work of the Christ Jesus after Pentecost, which is then chapter 7. So how does this all work? I suppose that's really, how do we access this, the second Adam, as Paul calls it, this new archetype that is created at the baptism, and reaches its fulfillment at the resurrection, and then, as we will see, in a way, is firmed in the world of archetypes through the Ascension and Pentecost. How does that actually take place? So we see at first that Zarathustra had left certain abilities behind in the three bodies of Jesus of Nazareth. And Christ was able to use these when straight after the baptism, he faces the three temptations in the desert. So in these accounts, especially Mark and Luke, he goes out into the desert, and Steiner talks about that, the human soul, in order to bring about freedom and love as the seed idea of our evolution, these two influences that Steiner calls Lucifer or Ahriman can also be seen as the devil or Satan. In other traditions, there's other names for the serpent and the dragon in the book of Revelation. But after leaving these abilities there, Christ was able to use these when he faced the spiritual entities who was to arouse or had arise pride and arrogance, and then also arrogance and conceit, and then the whole sense of human pride in the second temptation. And Steiner turns it around to say that at first the one counterforce approaches Christ with the pride, and then which was to worship Lucifer, and he could easily overcome that. The second temptation is where the two beings try to approach Christ together with overcoming the temptation of throwing himself off the temple, thinking he's above these powers. And then in the third approach, which is the transformation of stones into bread, Steiner puts that as the third temptation rather than the first, saying, Ahriman, or this more sclerotic, hardening forces of the human soul, approaches Christ to change the stones into bread. And Steiner suggests that this temptation was not entirely overcome by the Christ because the human being still needs to live off bread. We can't overcome that yet. And it's actually in the course of evolution that the lessons learned through the transformation of the human body, in the fact that we're living on the earth, need to be learned before we can really fulfill the overcoming of all those aspects. So this is where we see the Christ being has taken an initial transformation in the sheaths of Jesus, and Christ can begin to create new forces and impulses that humanity will later be able to develop themselves. So that's an initial pathway that is seeded. And then in the Gospel of John, we see the journey. I then focus very strongly on the Gospel of John as of how we try to create this this narrative. And I think I might have spoken about it in earlier times, but I go into much more detail here with the first and the second half of the three Passovers and the whole 21 chapters of the Gospel of John. The first 10 chapters, chapter 11 with the raising of Lazarus, and then the last 10 chapters as being two distinct halves in this journey of seeing the gospel as an initiation text. So Christ follows the stages of further transformations from the baptism. That's then he goes to the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water in John 6. And then there's a second as the transfiguration, which in the Gospel of John isn't related directly like it is in the other Gospels, but in John 1:14 and in chapter 12, we see how he reveals his light-filled body. In this sense, the transfiguration in John 12, as we enter into the second half, really is about us as the disciple who's on the journey to initiation, meeting the light-filled life body of Christ. This is given as its fait accompli, but he reveals himself as the light of the world. And then the third is the entry into Jerusalem. John 12:14 is the final transformation of the physical body of Jesus that sort of culminates in the death and resurrection. So we need to add to that then the role that the mother of Jesus plays in the inner path of transformation. And we've talked a little bit about this, that just before the baptism, Mary herself is transformed as well, that there's a whole transformation in the Gospel of John as the mother of Jesus. She's never named as Mary, but she is transformed as well so that she can participate in her journey from the marriage feast at Cana to the foot of the cross with the apostle John, or the disciple John, who we will talk about in a moment. That this narrative of Gospel of John reveals the work of Christ and the mother of Jesus in the transformation of the human being. So that's quite an important aspect. That we have this first half of transformation through the 7 signs in the first half. And then in the second half, Steiner brings about the 7 stages of crucifixion that go from the washing of the feet to the resurrection and ascension in different aspects in the Gospel of John. And we will go into that a little bit. So these journeys, we've talked about the development of the soul senses and the spiritual senses. So the first half of the journey is in meditation, where we meditate upon the 7 signs from the marriage feast at Cana through to the raising of Lazarus, which really Steiner talks about being a journey of transforming love, at first based in the blood, but further and further into the community, drawing on the help of others, the centurion, the group of circle of the disciples around the bread, then actually appearing in a more spiritual form, and the walking of the water, and then eventually right into a post-death experience of Lazarus, who becomes John the Evangelist. So that may be a point of contention for some people, that Steiner considers that the author of the Gospel of John, who's never named as John in the Gospel, but as the disciple whom the Lord loved, is also then born in his experience of meeting his initiation in the middle point. And then in the second part, we go to a further transformation of the forces of love. So in the first part, we're learning to transform love into healing forces in the world, in the individual. It's also the path that I've described as the imitation of Jesus, the path to selflessness, where we as human beings, if we follow meditatively these 7 steps and the 7 I am sayings that go with it in the first part, mainly in the first part of the Gospel of John, we begin this first transformation that Christ has seeded in our souls, along with
version for you as well.
So we then see finally how a person contemplating the narrative of the first half of the Gospel of John, along with the 7 I am sayings, work upon the individual to create the 7 soul organs of soul perception, as explained in chapter 3. So then we come to the next part, 6.5, death and resurrection. I'm just going to let Nicola in.
Yeah.
What happened there? Did Nicola manage to...
You were frozen.
Are we all there?
Yes,
We
Nicola
are now.
is.
We're all back. Sorry, I don't know what I did there in the middle of the recording. Hi, Nicola.
Sorry about this.
That's okay. We got confused between the starting times, I think. Yeah. Sorry, I sent 2 possibilities and then we landed back on the
And
first.
then maybe I just sort of saw 8 p.m.
Yeah. You decided that was it.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, that's okay. I've just sort of went through 6.4, which was the baptism and the transformation. I'm now going to head into the death and resurrection, which is in the second part of the Gospel of John. The first half gives the narratives through meditation to prepare the disciple in the imitation of Jesu. And then the raising of Lazarus is this initiation point that comes as a symbol or an experience that a modern person of faith might, through meditation on the gospel, actually be able to awaken those soul forces within oneself. And then in the second part, Steiner talks about we go through the 7 stages of the cross. So from the washing of the feet, the scourging, the crowning of thorns, the bearing of the cross and crucifixion, the mystical death, burial, and resurrection, and the ascension into heaven as 7 stages of this place, which is no longer, it's another layer. He had talked about, in the old mystery schools, you had the first preparation, which was an awakening of the soul. You went into a temple sleep. But when you actually took the experiences of the mysteries right down into your knowledge, you went through a temple death. And that's why he's talks about in the first half, we can meditatively go through the 7 signs. In the second part, we need to go through these 7 stages. He says we need to experience them in our destiny. And he describes, one can read this. I mean, if one's wanting to read more about this, the lecture cycle that Steiner gave was called the Gospel of St. John, and its relation to the other Gospels is a core text. It's in his collected works 112 for those who are interested in reading more detail about these things. But this is where we go into the next level of the process that I call the imitation, or not I call, but it's known as the imitation of Christ, which is like a catharsis. So if the first part in the imitation of Jesus is an emptying out to selflessness, the imitation of Christ is a catharsis where then the spiritual senses are born. So we're looking at, these 4 parts in the Gospel of John, where we see it as an historical event, Christ as an objective spiritual entity that fulfilled the transformations in the text that I've spoken about so far. And then now we've gone to the mythical initiation stories. And the 4th is then Christ as a force of the Christ impulse that works, that the human being can draw to themselves. And how do we actually access those forces as a modern person of faith? Where can this where can we access these things ourselves? And I suggest that there's 3 places that we can access these forces ourselves. The one is where we can, in Christ himself, we have to transform discord into love. So that's one of the places. And Steiner talks about how we have to transform the outer battle in the world, which is war, into an inner battle of overcoming discord into love within ourselves. So we need to transform the warlike or the discord forces that we project out into the world into an inner journey. That's a place where we can do that. And that was given to us because Christ transformed human blood, basically, when the Christ died on the cross and the blood was released from the body. Steiner said that the selfishness or the egotism that was imprinted into the blood through the fall was given away, which allowed, this is the spiritual economy, allowed a certain selflessness to enter as a possibility as the human capacity, which then allows us to eliminate the discord within ourselves. The second concern that we can do with that is then seeing how Jesus and the mother work together. So the wisdom, and this is where we see at the fulfillment, where the connection of Jesus and Mary at the marriage feast of Cana fulfilled itself when the mother and John are standing at the cross, and a new kind of working together, a new school of transformation begins John the Evangelist and the mother of Jesus working together to bring about Christ as the light of the world into his soul. So John the Evangelist really takes this experience of Christ as the light of the world seriously and starts to work together with the mother. And she brings, Christ as the life of the world. So the light of the world and the life of the world working together in the mother and son. A new relationship that's not born of blood bonds can come into existence right at that moment of the death. And then the third aspect where we can, of course, bring about is through the Last Supper, so the institution of the Eucharist, where Christ imbues even right down to the very atoms, life and light forces into earth substance, where we can gain a new relationship in our hearts, where we can bring forces of attraction to draw the Christ Spirit to us through Holy Communion. And of course, different traditions have different ways of doing that. But Steiner talks about sacrament in the form of bread and wine as a preparation for the mystical union with Christ. And the sacrament of communion rises from a physical symbol to a spiritual reality for the Christian believer. So that's a third sort of journey on the how-tos where we can look at that. And then we see what happens at the resurrection. So we're still in 6.5, but in the resurrection, how do we understand that from an esoteric point of view? And again, we have to go back to the work of the Christ in the Jesus body. So that Nestorian thing of, you've got Jesus of Nazareth as the human aspect of this new being, and the Christ at work through the 3 years or the 3 Passovers of the Gospel of John. And that by the time he gets to the crucifixion, the human being is completely transformed. And what comes out of, Steiner talks about how at the crucifixion and the body is laid in the grave, that the work of the Son Spirit in the material component and the form component of Jesus of Nazareth is so complete that it decomposes at ashes, like an ash process, like a log that's burnt out. And what arises then is a transformed astral body and a transformed etheric body and a transformed physical body. And he suggests that the 2 angels sitting at the head and the foot of Jesus when they go in, and Mary sees, the 2 angels at the foot and the head are really not so much, they're angelic in nature, but they are the etheric body and the soul body of Jesus of Nazareth, that is no longer the physical body, mineral body. And that when Mary then comes to the garden and she sees the gardener, that is really the resurrection body, which Steiner then calls a form shape, which as a spiritual texture works upon the physical substance and forces so that they fill out the form which we encounter as the person on the physical plane. This is a very refined concept, but that, this is why the Christ can appear in different places, because it's not the body of Jesus coming out of the grave. It's the archetypal physical form recreated. It's the new archetype. It's the second Adam, and Steiner calls this the phantom, PH, not F. I don't know if that's a good word for it or not, because it's associated with so many things. But it's a completely new creation in the world that hasn't been there before. So Christ works upon the 3 bodies of Jesus of Nazareth in a way that is different from how the average person works upon their body. And so he suggests that, I've spoken about that already. So it's the fully restored archetypal physical human body created in through the archangels and the angels through ages now arises, which Paul calls the second Adam. It's a complete restoration. It's not a complete restoration of the mineral body of Jesus. So that's a whole thing to contemplate in itself. And then when we look at Ascension and Pentecost, just as a final point in this, because time is marching on, we see that, Christ's greatest sacrifice is that he left being the spirit of the Son and became the spirit of the earth. And this whole journey from the birth of Jesus, the baptism, the journey on the earth, the death and resurrection, and creating this new being is that he can imbue himself to take up residence in the life and soul of earth beings. And therefore, he has to make a sort of another journey of consolidating these conditions because of the project of developing love out of freedom and freedom out of love in the human being. And if we could see the Christ every day, we would really not want to misbehave. So we would just love because it is just so powerful. And so he had to remove himself from the physically perceptible into another realm, which biblically is called the realm of the clouds or the sky. And Steiner sort of indicates that that's the world, the realm of the etheric world, or the spiritual, and the world of the life forces that radiate. We've talked about this in a sense of Teilhard de Chardin with the noosphere, that there's these other more subtle spheres around the earth, and the Christ embodies himself through ascension into that. And Steiner says, through the ascension, the work that Christ did on the human constitution, the spiritual economy, the work that was created in the body of the Jesus of Nazareth is given to every human being on earth. Every human being, regardless of background, has this inscription, the seed form of the Christ and human constitution. Pentecost then is where we are given the capacity to fulfill that through ourselves. So Pentecost is where the Christ comes back as the spirit of the earth and imbues the astral, etheric, and physical bodies. And so we see the possibility of then, I sort of say maybe Pentecost, again, just a sort of one of the little asides that I make here is to say that if we see Pentecost as Christ coming back as the experience of the Holy Spirit, is that a third member of the Trinity, or is it a new modality of, has God transformed so much that it can work in a new modality? If we look in the Gospel of John, he says, I and the Father in me, and I in you, when he's describing the Holy Spirit, the human being's experience and the taking up of the Christ impulse and fulfilling it in itself is the emergence of the Holy Spirit. So Pentecost really is, well, in Steiner's view, is really the archetype then of what was firmed in the life and the forms of the earth through the mystery of Golgotha, through the work of Christ and the Mother together, seeded into the mystery of the Mother and John the Evangelist as a mystery school, now being able to be given over to the work of the individual to fulfill in themselves. So Christ came to experience the whole reality of the human condition and brought the knowledge of death and its transformation to the spiritual world through ascension. As the place from which he works, it is also the world we enter when we die. Christ had let his power of love flow into the cosmic aura of the earth as the part of the spiritual sphere of the earth where all souls meet after death to begin their journey to the worlds of higher light. And then Pentecost is the event of the return of Christ to work within the human soul. It is a remembering of the wisdom and truth. So this remembering is a really important part of how do we remember the Christ into it's the beginning of a new form of initiation. And I think that kind of covers it off to where we get to by the end of this chapter. I just mentioned there that the sort of the first person after Pentecost who could fulfill this particular journey was Saul on the road to Damascus in his experience of the light of Christ. And we could say that Paul is the first to experience this power of fulfilling the resurrected Christ within himself. He was not one of the disciples present in the teaching, nor witness to anything of Christ's life. but he represents the first step of the individual undertaking preparation. Because, he was a high Jewish initiate expecting this fulfillment. And it was a bit of a surprise for him that it was the one that he was persecuting who was doing it. But he received the enlightenment out of the working of his initiation. So Steiner's hermeneutical key of Paul's not I, but the Christ in me really stands as the archetype of modern initiation in Steiner's Christology. Experienced for the first time in Saul Paul. And I think I'm going to stop there because that's the end of that chapter.
That's a good place. Jude, I feel like I'm sitting at the edge of a lake on a warm, sunny day. It's like with the water sparkling in front of me, and it's like feeling these beautiful, empowering, love-filled forces like waft over me. There's this memory aspect. It's so beautiful to hear you weave it all together, and I'd be really interested to hear, especially Nicola and Rain, and so I've got a few questions as well, but it's like your own experiences of listening to Jude, and I'm fully aware of my own biases in this. This is familiar territory to me, but when you're listening to this, is there also this sense of this Christ being that we're talking about here is something so mind-blowingly infinite, but at the same time so intimately connected with each and every one of our own, it's like individual lives? Sorry, that ended up being a leading question. What I was more interested in was so when you're sitting, listening, and trying to absorb this, where do you go? Where does your soul go? Where does your thinking go?
I thought that was very beautiful the way you described it, Angus. I suppose, I've had a busy day.
Yeah. She's on the other 12 hours ahead of you.
Getting a little resistance, but I could appreciate it at the same time, how beautiful it was. I did have this, that I have resistance to some of this, Jude. But I don't know, I was also sort of trying to work out, the current obsession with everything being in the body, and resurrection being sometime in the future in the body, which I don't go along with, but it's ever present these days because everybody wants to prove that they're not dualists,
Yeah.
It's a vain kind of attempt if you're a Christian, I think. But what would you say to that particular tendency? You probably don't run into it because you are in Steiner circles, but I run into it.
Yeah, I could say something to that.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the real, Steiner really, one of his core threads was the turn of the search for spirituality by lifting reason into more ideas and turning it to seek for it in the material is a real problem for him. And this is one of his core things, is that if we're looking for to preserve the physical body, and it's quite a subtle exploration, because you have to go into sort of substance theory, where the atoms and the chemicals of our bodies are material, but there's more substance than just matter and atoms, which includes etheric substance. And so to see that the work of the sun forces in the matter of Christ's physical material body transformed it into a light being. And so the resurrection body is not a preservation of in the physical as we And this is the problem, because it's still it's still the physical body,
Yeah.
a spiritualized spiritual physical body, and not what's going to come out of the grave on the day of judgment, as some traditions would have.
And I mean, the other thing, yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that. But I mean, how do you actually, I mean, in an ecological sense, the question always is, well, why bother about this life and this material being, because we're going to get this light body. And
Yeah.
yeah, and so what would your response be to that?
To
I mean,
why bother about this life?
about this life, because there's always going to be, this great spirit body to come, full of life and life. I mean, my response would be that God thought it was important enough to actually come and spend time in this, in this body that we inhabit at the moment. And so therefore it doesn't matter in a sense what comes next. It's important to do this bit. But what would you say?
Well, I'd say two things to that. So the one is why did the gods or God deem us essential to be in this body as part of, because it's
And everything else too,
and everything else, absolutely, the animals and the rocks and the landscapes, all the things that have what the earth as an organism is, all of that, including the planets and et cetera. So and this is the idea that if the idea that the mission of Earth evolution is to develop love out of freedom. So, God said, let there be light, and the angels out of their love just did it, because they were not separate from God's will. But to be able to love and transform love out of freedom, we needed a body that made us individualized.
And with time, and not everything could happen all at once.
Yeah, and therefore, and we can't fulfill that in one lifetime. You can't fulfill, and so there's a certain, and this is where chapter 4 came in, the necessity of understanding the possible of repeated earth lives, because we improve through various iterations of our destinies, and slowly transform as a collective the physical body. But there's a time where it's essential to be on the earth and learn through human frailty and error. And
I just like the idea of there being other lives.
You don't like that?
I do.
Oh yeah.
I think this one isn't quite satisfactory. So yes.
Yeah.
What, you were going to say something, Angus?
Sorry, I'll be
No. I'd like to add a little bit, a couple of things to the interesting point you're talking about there. When Jude said, I don't want to get into substance theory, I want to just have a couple of thoughts around that, because within the faith, faith is a substance.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting, this idea that faith is a substance, and so it certainly, if you're a Catholic, there'll be no problem for you in accepting that and living with that idea. Yet we have this problematic idea that there can't be a similar type of substance aspect to the human being. So that might be a way of sort of like getting into what is this phantom, and that was actually the word that I wanted to talk about. The extent to which it is problematic. Of course, a superficial reading of phantom is hugely problematic. It's going to scare a lot of people away. But if you are,
we need another word.
No,
Halloween.
I disagree. I understand why you say. I understand why you say we need another word, but I'm going to
understand that word more fully.
Exactly, and if we go to the etymology of that word, which is fein, and my Greek pronunciation is rubbish, but basically it means to make appear. It's like that which makes something appear.
And would that have a correlation with phane, to shine?
Exactly.
Greek phane is the light, the shining of the light. Epiphane,
yeah. So that it's got that root. So that actually makes Steiner's choice of word actually a very
Quite interesting.
wise choice actually
Yeah.
in mind. And
Yeah.
I was thinking, and the reason for sticking with that word, it would be, and this is for the mathematicians among us, it'd be like saying we shouldn't use the word mean when we're talking about it's like the number, it's like the average number, because mean means horrible and nasty, and we're making a value judgment about. I mean, it's
Or,
ridiculous to a mathematician to
or,
say that.
or we shouldn't use the word imaginary number, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's just imaginary. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So people have to up their game
Mm.
and understand what is actually meant by a word rather
Sure.
than assuming they
Sure.
know what it
Absolutely.
means.
And really ponder it. I'd be interested in Raynon's take on substance being more than just chemistry and matter as a physics teacher or as a physics.
I don't want to take that literally, like the substance, like referring to the atomic features or something like that. But yeah, reflecting on myself, so like, well, technically, all your ideas, I'm still trying to digest all of those ideas, and I'm thinking to myself how I'm going to translate all these ideas into a simplified sense that, if I'm talking to street people, they could understand. Because I myself, sometimes there's a degree of highly high abstraction. So like something that's everything here, but cannot be really perceived. So like as a teacher, so like how I'm going to explain that in a very sensible,
Yeah.
practical, plain, street terms, casual terms. But yeah, I cannot fully say what I'm thinking, but um, I think in terms of uh, substance, I could relate one of the terms here in section 6.6 about Christ removing himself from the realm of the physically perceptible
Yeah.
to that of another realm, the realm of the clouds or the sky, where he can continue to work through grace into a physical world. It seems to me that, okay, we are restricted with this atomic reality, and you need to be out of that atomic system to be fully free, sort of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
I remember I came across with some news, like real news, documentaries about in hospitals, for example, about some people were declared clinically dead, but they came back and they felt that they shared stories about they felt that unexplainable degree of freedom and happiness, something like that. So seems
Yeah.
similar to this conversation we're having right now.
Yeah.
That another realm where Jesus went to, again, of course, scientifically not cannot be proven, cannot be measured, cannot be observed.
Yeah.
So how I could explain that to people whose knowledge are just,
Yeah.
in this plain level. Yeah, so
And we
I'm still painting on everything, but yeah, you are sharing a very good thought and reflections, information. Yeah.
I think we're all at that level though, because we can't imagine what not being subject to decay is. Because
Exactly.
we live with stochastic processes that lead inevitably to decay. And yet there is this promise of not decay, which just
Yeah.
seems we can't imagine it, Yeah.
Yeah. And that's sort of that sense of how do we understand the fall?
Mm.
I prefer to sort of say it, the taking on of the physical body, which is,
Mm.
subject to death. Whereas Paul then says, this other body is incorruptible. And we
Mm.
live in this sort of dual trying to bridge these two worlds together. Yeah.
I guess.
So to add so build on your question or reflection there, Nicola, about how do we understand these stochastic, these processes of delay. One way that I spontaneously respond to that type of question is I don't try to understand it. I try to experience and I try to identify where that process is ever ongoing in me. And one example of that could be, so like my body is continually falling apart, but at the same time it is continually being repaired. Yeah, so like the skin, it's like on my body, it's like it'll all be gone within, I don't know what, a biology teacher, let's say it's like within a month, and within 7 years, basically every component, every sort of atom of my body has been taken out and sort of recycled.
That's true, but even so,
living into the mystery of that. But so where is the permanence in that? So who this person that has all these memories of sort of like when he was 7 years old and 12 years old, how is that even possible if not one single atom is left there? And living into that real experience, I'm not hypothesizing anything, I'm taking scientific facts, and then I'm taking my own experience of who I am, what I am as a human being, and recognize that not only can I do that, but every single person can do that to varying extents. Remember, there is something permanent in me that seems to be totally disconnected to the continual destruction that's going on in my body.
It's very mysterious, isn't it?
Yeah, and living into that mystery.
It means that memory can't really be in the brain. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's one of those substances that's not a substance.
That's not material.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think we need to broaden our definitions of substances, what is life substance and what you were describing there, Angus, is that the faith substance, the light body? What are these things? Yeah.
If nobody's got a question, I'd like you to unpack a little bit more, because I think you could, when you were talking about temple sleep and temple death, it's like you were talking about it specifically in relation to John, but it might be useful to explain how we see multiple instances of that also in the Old Testament, that this isn't something new that's just been invented for the Gospel of John. Are you catching on to what I'm thinking there, Jude?
Yeah. When you say the Old Testament, what are you thinking about in particular?
About the prophets, what was going on with the prophets there. That there's also there you're looking at some type of initiation experience.
Sure.
So like Jonah and the whale.
Jonah,
and these type of
Job,
exactly.
Job, all these different experiences. I think Steiner's version of this is that this is a process that's always been around, even beyond Old Testament, New Testament. But in different cultures, you have this process, and we've been talking around it in the fact that we are in a ever more deeply in the material world, and the veils of consciousness that cut off our experience of the law of the stars, as the indigenous people would call it, the law in the stars and the law in the land. Our consciousness is more and more veiled from that, especially in the Western tradition. In the indigenous traditions, it's obviously quite different, and we should really acknowledge that this is a Western perspective. Probably even in the more Eastern countries, the veiling is possibly not quite as deep as in the over-intellectualized Western tradition. So in the struggle with that, in pre-Christian mystery schools, there was people were selected. They were less individuated, but they were selected to go into preparation to experience. John the Baptist was one of the people who could do that. He had a school. He would take people, and through the water initiation, they would be open to a spiritual experience. And this required a preparation, and there were layers of that. And he talks about how in the human constitution, you've got this, the thing we realize as in our soul, and then how that sits as a transformative seed in the body, as the two layers of initiation. So the initiation of the soul, you went through preparations, and then you were put into a sarcophagus, basically, for 3 days, and the hierophants would sit around you, and you would be put to sleep like Lazarus was, and had a 3-day experience of the soul body meeting these experiences in the other substance, in the spiritual world. And then once you had sort of integrated that experience of the soul, that needed to be taken to a deeper experience into the seeds in the life body within me. And that's where you had to go through a death experience. And so if we look at the Gospel of John, Steiner describes that as a transformation for a Christian form of that initiation, where a person who is a Christian going a mystical path could use the stages of description in the first half meditatively to prepare the soul forces, and then would come to a point where they would have a Lazarus-like experience, where they would go, I get a certain part of this understanding in my soul, which we could say is my understanding and my feeling and my will impulses. That then, Lazarus then had to, and this is assuming that Lazarus and John the Evangelist are the same person. He then has to go and take it into the seed of his life forces, which is where the mother comes in. So this union with the mothering forces of the mother of Jesus is where a second layer, having gone through experiencing these, and as a modern initiate, we need to go through a crucifixion in our life. I mean, we all know that we can be mocked and flagellated and betrayed and all these things that are in that second half of the story that bring a certain wisdom into our body, and we eventually get to imprint that knowledge into a seed form in our life bodies, and that is a death and resurrection process. And in a modern sense, we don't do it in the way we did in the mystery schools. We don't literally go and lie in a sarcophagus, or go and have a John-like initiation where you are submerged into water and actually die. Near-death experiences are modern forms of this that are done without preparation, in a way. And Reynard was talking about that. People, really experience something very powerful there that goes right down into their life experience. You can't take it away from their experience. And so he sees this narrative of the Gospel of John as a step-by-step possibility for a meditant and a person of faith living their life, how to read life as an initiation of these higher forces in themselves. And so this thing of the mystery sleep and the mystery death is inscripted into John's experience, because he went through it himself. And he's going, from my point of view, I mean, the other Gospels are other ways of doing it, but from the point of view of Lazarus and John, this is a particular way of transforming the old mysteries into an individual initiation process. And Nicola and I have talked about that. How's that then integrated into community and false initiations, and all those are sort of complex conversations that will come up in chapter 7. What are the protections of in a modern world that this doesn't send you crazy, et cetera, or make you ill. Yeah.
And by the way, sorry, very quick. Yeah, it did not actually sink in to my consciousness about the missing years of Jesus, not in the lifetime of during my Catholic, back in my Catholic background in schools, not until today. So that is something probably I could revisit, or could be my homework. I'm quite interested, because it was So,
Yeah. And there's lots of stuff emerging, like he could have gone to India and be taught by a lama. He might have been in England. He might have been in America. I mean, there's places where there's stories of Jesus having been there in those 18 years. How's that possible that we're suddenly finding these other possibilities of where he was in those, and what was he learning? Yeah. Yeah.
Just a further reflection on, you were talking about near-death experiences.
Mm.
When you begin to read the literature around that, and there is a lot of literature, there are a lot of meta studies that have been done, so it's like it has a scientific grounding. But what is very interesting when you listen to individuals talk about their experience, very often it is an earth-shattering experience, something that completely transforms their vision of life.
Mm.
But at the same time, there is it's like they've been given this experience, and then you'll hear people say something along the lines of, but it took me 20 years to begin to understand what had actually happened to me, to actually process this. And the soul exercises that you were referring to, the meditation on the I ams, they are one way of understanding them. This is a preparation for an experience that all of us will have at some time in the future. And will it destroy our lives? Will it turn our lives completely upside down? Will we meet resistance with people outside who sort of like ridicule what we're saying? That process has to be gone through. It can either be done consciously before the event, or in a way, a near-death experience will force us to confront this other side of
And most
reality.
people, I think, don't talk about it at all because it doesn't register with the people around them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where, for me, coming out of my own Catholic background, these frameworks that Steiner draws, especially it was a huge step of expanding consciousness to take a look at the possibility of reincarnation. But it's this thing of spiritual economy. The work I do this lifetime may not lead to an initiation experience, but it is seeded in my being and will transform in the period between two lives, and I can continue picking that up. And then the question comes of, why can't I remember my past lives comes up, which the simplest answer is, if you knew what your past life was, you wouldn't need to be doing the work, because you'd remember what you need to do. But that's maybe a bit too shallow. But we actually have the chance to come at it again and again and again, to keep the refinement process of the preparations at work. Maybe that's anyway. That opened up a door for me. That because you could say, well, I've worked all my life and nothing's happened. Have I failed? If I've only got one life. On the other hand, this is the only life I've got right now to do the work. That's why we need to focus on this life, because that was quietism was, well, why should I do any work? I can do it next time.
And what you've just done there is you've presented a good case for like keeping quiet the idea of reincarnation for a long period, so that people take each individual life seriously. It is. I can't just like, I'll do it tomorrow, mañana. No.
Yeah. Well, we've run out of our hour, or we've gone through our hour, so I'm going to turn that recording off.